Is it a church? Is it an assembly hall? Is it a folly? Actually, it's none of the above and all of them. Yes, it has got a sign, but no, that does not tell us what it really is or isn't. For sure, it's a tourist attraction, but it's so much more than that. Point of fact, it's one man's dream. That's what it says in the guidebook, and it's spot on. The man in question, Frederick Thomas Glascock, was a millionaire back in the day when that meant a bit more than just sitting on a flat in Peckham. He made his pile in the smoke. His dessert sauce manufacturing company went on to become Bird's Custard, if you please. Then he came down to Cornwall to give serious welly to his obsession, passion, vocation, delete where applicable, the legend of Arthur. Good place for it, as it's widely believed, if he existed at all, this is where he did his king thing. More about that later, much more. For the moment, let's take a closer look at this extraordinary building, officially opened way back in 1933. Okay, it has its whoops-a-daisy moments. Armour like this postdates Arthurian legend by centuries.
You weren't there. You're probably wrong.
Likewise, this painting of baby Arthur at Tintagel Castle, which hadn't even been built at the time. But Kerno Disney, this is not. In fact, it's the only intact building in the world exclusively dedicated to the Arthurian legend. And amazingly impressive it is too, especially when you hit the Great Hall. It's huge, handsome, and, well, sturdy. Tasty bit of granite. This throne complex alone weighs 23 tons. No expense spared then, it would seem. These pictures, with a powerfully pre-Raphaelite feel, were painted by a man who'd illustrated work by Thomas Hardy, William Blake, and J.M. Barrie of Peter Pan fame. This one's entitled The Entrance of Sir Galahad to the Court of King Arthur. The Knighting of Galahad by Sir Lancelot. King Arthur offered the sword Excalibur by the Lady of the Lake. The return of Queen Guinevere and Sir Lancelot to King Arthur. The final battle between King Arthur and Sir Mordred. Sir Lancelot refuses the sight of the Sangreal. The achievement of the Sangreal by Sir Galahad. The passing of King Arthur to the Vale of Avignon. The stained glass windows, said to be the finest of their kind anywhere, were created by a hugely respected woman artist called Veronica Wall, who'd studied under William Morris. To quote from the plaque, the primary object in building this hall is to show the strength of King Arthur and the beauty of the fellowship of his knights. These windows on each side of the hall illustrate the means by which a night was made perfect and therefore beautiful. But Glasscock was a tough operator. He disputed her bill, and it went as far as the High Court before it got settled. He was also rather given to hiring and firing builders willy-nilly, all of which doubtless kept costs down. But he did get the chivalry and do-gooding stuff that his fellowship was all about. Witness his stipulation that all branches help finance children's hospices, and is giving the locals a village hall, school hall, playing fields and other bits and bobs. It was also pretty cool on the gender agenda. The Round Table Order, which dates back to the 14th century, later morphed into a gentleman's club. Glasscock was happy to join, but stipulated they accept ordinary folk and women on an equal basis. When the chap said nope, he said bye, and founded his own variant of the order down here under a slightly different name. Membership mushroomed. Some newspaper reports suggested to as much as 250,000, and in no time at all it was paying for itself very nicely. Thank you very much. Glasscock may have taken things a whole lot further had not fate taken a hand. Only a year after the halls opened, he died of a heart attack. His widow effectively mothballed the place for 15 years, but then the Freemasons took over and to this day hold their meetings here. That would have been fine by him, as he was well into the movement himself. But perhaps more to the point, the place has also welcomed visitors in their millions over the years. And I'm joined now by John Moore, the current custodian of the place. So John, how's the current account looking now?
Well, we're taking over, Peter. We do a lot of bus tours here from all over the world, but we're very weather dependent. But every year we get thousands come through the door to see us.
What do they think of it?
They're taken aback because from the front of the building they don't realise how big it is. But they come here from all over the world because of what's in the Great Hall out the back, the world's biggest collection of pre-Raphaelite stained glass windows in the world. So
are they sort of, gosh?
Yes, they are, yeah. Some people get quite emotional out there because it's also consecrated ground, it's holy ground. And they do get, especially if they're in there on their own, they get very emotional.
And what about the kids? What's in it for them?
The kids can't, well, they're taken up with the thrones because they can sit in the thrones and they can run around out there because people don't realise how big it is, the Great Hall.
And the connection between, the real life connection between Arthur and Tintagel, what do you make of it?
Oh, my personal opinion is that there was a leader of a band of men in this part of the country, and that was who King Arthur was. That's my opinion, but everybody's got their own opinion on it.
So it's a bit more than a legend to you, it's for real.
Yeah, there was something there. There was something, yes.
Brilliant, John, thank you so much. And whether you believe a word of it or not, it is a gripping tale of power politics, of love, adultery, crimes of passion. The trickiest bit was when Arthur's wife, Guinevere, took up with Arthur's close friend and chief lieutenant, Sir Lancelot. Different writers tell different stories, but let's go with the tale of Lancelot and Guinevere falling for one another the moment he came over from France. Imagine the explosion of emotion when it all came out. Arthur's anger, pain, jealousy, terror perhaps, but first off, blind fury.
Ah, no, my lord. We meet against our age, when we would choose to cross unguarded blades. But we are met by circumstance and adult chance. Methinks your grace did not expect to greet a Frenchman thus, where chivalry and honor so often have graced this lofty hall.
Indeed, 'tis true. We did not choose it so, but bitter business must be executed low.
My lord!
What does this faithless woman here, this creature? Proud we were once to call our wife, should hide her face for shame from all but cloistered son until the sentence of the court be rightful done. And that sentence is she must burn
My dearest lord!
at daybreak on an urgent morn.
Have pity on each of us. We plead full earnestly. Who rule the court and mitigate this judgment with a gentle eye?
Be gentle. On adultery, deceit, on treason. So it is, dishonor is a stain no gentle eye can weep away. 'Tis done, and Guinevere must roundly pay, or offer argument in her defense.
My lord, she did right love thee faithfully until her love was lit. And then the flame grew fiercer still for her fidelity. Had she not loved thee truly, there would be no sin.
How so?
Because, my lord, the flame denied will burn its honor clean, destroying heart and will in constant enmity. That fire will overrule all quiet peace, until the solemn moment when the spirit cries aghast for cease. And after is the murder of all joy, where life shall last. No comfort anywhere. The loss of husband's love is torture by its own remorse.
Sir. Let the sentence stand. She shall burn. Not on the pyre, but by her sin, the daily agony of which will outlast life. We banish both of thee from Camelot. Come not again upon our scene. So go thy ways. King Arthur's court must be without queen.
And Lancelot must close the woman in a holy place. Alive, but silent, till her days be done. No love, no husband, but the hollow moon, and the bitter knowledge of 3 ruined lives. My liege, we thank thee for thy generosity.
My lord, no words can compass sorrow of such agony as aches for this affair within my breast. No night so dread will shadow e'er again. Thou hast lost every noble blessing due to thee. My heart must tremble for thy clemency.
There's no kindness, but a right that sin must pay its fee. Adieu, sweet wife, for so thou wert to us. We bid thee sad farewell to all our happy days. Go kindly in the better world away from here. And think King Arthur gentle in our parted spheres.
You get the idea here. The classic love triangle gone horribly wrong, though the outcome could have been worse. In one version of the story, Arthur does not soften the sentence, leaving it to Lancelot to thwart him. This painting tells how he rescues Guinevere from the fire in the nick of time. But this is only one among many different takes on the Arthurian legend, with connections allegedly to places as far apart as Brittany, Ireland, Scotland, Norway, and even Iceland. There are also several similarities to the ancient Greek story of Theseus: swords, stones, quests for special things. This part of North Cornwall, though, gets star billing in the best-known version of the tale told by the 12th century historian Geoffrey of Monmouth. Happens he was pretty thick at the time with the Duke of Tintagel. Some sort of early marketing scam, the guidebook impishly wonders. Time to call in an expert, Professor Roly Rotheram, former member of Her Majesty's personal staff, lecturer, broadcaster, bon viveur, and leading expert on all things Arthurian. Well, Roly, who was this bloke Arthur then?
The chap that we're looking at is a warlord. He's if you like, chief of the general staff. He's one of these chaps he's in command of the troops, but he's a mercenary, as are the men under his command. He's not the most heroic of figures, if you're looking in history. Or if you're looking in legend, of course, he's all things to all people. He's the captain of the first 15 and everything, you know.
And what got you interested in this?
Well, I mean, I grew up in Glastonbury in Somerset. I've been fascinated ever since I was about 5 or 6 years old. My favourite uncle gave me a book, which I still have. My first real book, it had got no pictures in. And it was The Legends of King Arthur and the Knights of the Table Round. And that started it. And that's when the rot set in, if you like. And I've been fascinated with the man, the legends, and the period ever since.
And then, of course, there's Geoffrey of Monmouth, the historian, who links Arthur to this place. What do you make of that?
Well, if you're trying to link an historical figure to Tintagel, it can be done. First of all, people are looking for Camelot. Well, there isn't one. There's a string of them. But you see, he is the commander of virtually a nomadic cavalry band, and they have a number of headquarters that they can use up and down the country. They took over the old Iron Age hill forts, and they refortified them. Places like Cadbury, places like Llangollen in North Wales. These were all used. And coming down here, there's absolutely no reason to suppose that he would not have used what we now know to have existed, which is buildings of high status where the castle now stands, even though that is a much later addition, if you like. There's no reason to suspect that there isn't a germ of truth behind the legend.
What is the significance of the legend as far as you're concerned?
Well, for me, there's a huge amount of significance. The legend points to this marvellous time when everything was better than it is now. In time of trouble, we always look back to a golden age, and our most golden age would be that of the fabled King Arthur. I mean, if you go on to Morte d'Arthur, Thomas Malory, one of the greatest romances ever written, there was never a kingdom like that. It couldn't have existed. Everything's too perfect. It's a bit like Spenser's Faerie Queen as an allegory of the Elizabethan court. Everything is perfect. Nothing ever is. But you look back on it with affection. I mean, now you'll get people of a certain age say, oh, well, of course, it wasn't like that when Churchill was Prime Minister, and it wasn't like that when the old king was on the throne. Well, I mean, I can remember the old king, you know. But you always look back to a time when you perceive things to have been better. And we must remember the words of my favourite Roman, Gaius Petronius Arbiter, who said, there is no distinction between that which is real and that which I perceive to be real.
And you mentioned the Romans, of course, and you also mentioned the old days. One can imagine that during the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, Britain was in a pretty chaotic state.
Oh, yes.
Which is where Arthur comes in.
Yeah, absolutely. This is the platform for, if you like, his birth, his start in history. You've had Rome in control here for hundreds of years. I mean, if you imagine Rome is leaving today, that means they would have arrived round about the time just before the English Civil War. That's a hell of a long occupation, really. They did a very sensible thing. Britain was split up into little kingdoms, and each one had a little king or queen. They kept them like that, divide and conquer. Easier to control, you know.
The Brits in India are the same.
Of course. So this is probably where we got the idea, you know. They're a lot easier to maintain a stable government over if you keep them separate. When they decide that the time has come that they must fall back to the 7 hills, even though it's probably 8, you've got the situation whereby central government is now removed. There is no longer a standing army, no longer a civil service to govern it, and all of a sudden you're back to the way you were before Rome arrived, but nobody remembering how to do it. And this is where Arthur comes in. His people arrived here end of the 1st, beginning of the 2nd century. He, by nationality, was a Sarmatian. Eastern Europe, round about Bosnia-Herzegovina, farthest east of the Roman Empire. His people are cavalry, which is phenomenal because Roman cavalry was rubbish at that point. All of a sudden they inherit these wonderful horsemen. And as anybody can tell you, if you're taken over by Rome, make sure you join the Roman army or the Roman civil service. Regular pay, pension, tremendous. So they come here with their wives, sweethearts, what have you, and they're sent up to the Antonine Wall, which is the original line of separation between us and the Scots, or the Hibernians, I should say. And then we fell back to Hadrian's Wall about 100 years afterwards. And there they remained for about 300 years. They were virtually forgotten about. And then when Rome finally decided to go back, they started calling in all the divisions, and somebody said, "Oh, hang on, we've got this bunch up there. What are they? Oh, crikey, we forgot about those." And they sort of said, "Well, are you coming with us?" Or they said, "Well, no, we'll stay where we are." So they stayed where they were and became a mercenary band, fighting for whichever of the little kingdoms was going to pay them in their own little struggles to take control of a larger area. I mean, we all know Vortigern, who became sort of High King by, he was more or less, almost like a Borgia, if you like, you know, bump them off and take control. But Arthur is there to help out these little kings who are paying him, but also to fight a series of actions down the border with the Saxons in an effort to keep them in one place, because Britain is having an exodus. Virtually the entire population of Britain is leaving, and they're going to Brittany, this land that they've got in the north of France, where they found this new kingdom. And if you go there, some of the words they use are actually the same as Welsh and Cornish. They're actually cousins of ours. And this is what he's doing. He's playing for time and doing a damn good job of it.
So, looking at who Arthur might have been and what he might have been up to round here, let's give a moment's thought to what role, if any, Tintagel Castle might have played. The answer is apparently none whatever, as it was little more than a glorified Norman holiday home built half a millennium after the demise of the Caesars. But, and this is a huge but, coming up. As Professor Rotheram says, Tintagel Island is also home to a very much older high-status building, which would have come in jolly handy for Arthur if he happened to be around. It's certainly a profound historical interest, which is why the archaeologist Wyn Scutt and his team troubled to excavate it not so very long ago. It seems to have been some kind of royal palace and was constructed at around the time of the collapse of the Roman Empire, which means it does at least fit to the Arthur narrative. Would be great if we could prove that he wasn't just a myth or a legend, but a real living person. What do you think, Wyn? Do you think your stuff has taken us any further forward?
Well, it does take us a little bit further forward. What we're not here to prove is whether Arthur existed or not. What we've been doing is scientific excavations to try and understand what the settlement was like here, what the character of it was. Back in the 1930s, when it was first discovered, this really early settlement, Charles Roly Rotheram, who excavated it, thought it was a monastery. And in subsequent years, well, mainly in the 80s, people came round to the idea that it was probably a royal site. Now, the clue that gave them that idea was that the whole site is strewn with amazing pottery. And it's not from Britain. It's not even from Western Europe. It's coming all the way from Turkey and from Greece and from North Africa. And this site is just totally unusual compared with all other sites in Britain. This site, as far as we can see, had about 100 buildings, and it's actually bigger than London at the time. So, and we've got nothing like this in the whole country with the same amount of exotic pottery from the Byzantine world of the Eastern Mediterranean. In fact, we've got more pottery from the few excavations on this site than all the other sites of that period in Britain.
If nothing else, it seems to tell us that the EU is not a 20th century construct. It goes back so much further.
Well, yes, during the Roman Empire, when Britain was part of the Roman Empire, well, we were Roman, we were part of that European unit for nearly 400 years. That's 4 centuries. I mean, you know, think of 4 centuries. Where does that take us if you go back from that? It takes us back to the 17th century, you know, to the English Civil War and all that sort of thing. It's a tremendously long period. So when Rome withdraws its legions in 410 AD, Britain is basically left to its own devices. And we lose most historical evidence, pretty well all of it.
That's why they call it the Dark Ages.
Yeah, that's why they called it the Dark Ages. We avoid that term these days. I mean, it was invented by historians who didn't have any historical writings, but now we've got lots of archaeology coming out and we're starting to understand it much more. But it's still very difficult. It is almost dark because it's a time when different states are re-emerging. So when the light of history does come along, around about 800 AD, so 400 years after the departure of the Romans, we start to see states forming like Mercia, Northumbria, Wessex, Kent, all these new states. These are polities, these are independent nations. And you just start to see them coalesce and form hundreds of years later. So we've got 400 years of what we used to call Dark Ages, 400 years of no written records, and 400 years of this extraordinary archaeology of presumably separate states. And here at Tintagel, it's probably a royal site, if you want to call it royal. It's a local leader. They probably would have given themselves a kingly name, or even a queenly name, you know. All the indications are because of the elite material culture we're getting, these pots, the glass, these beautiful artifacts. It suggests that there's people of very, very high status here.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about the little bit of light on the Dark Ages. I imagine it's possibly telling you that life actually, at least for those in the upper echelons, was a good deal more sophisticated than people thought.
Yes, definitely. Because here we're getting beautiful bowls for feasting. We're getting amphorae, these big amphorae that are clearly for either wine or olive oil. So they are indulging in high status eating and drinking. The bowls suggest feasting. We have beautiful glass vessels. In fact, sometimes you can even pick up tiny piece of glass lying on the ground here after a shower of rain, and you look at it and you think, oh, it's a milk bottle, you know, but it's very thin and it's really clear. It's actually part of a 5th or 6th century cone cup, which are like an ice cream cone. You couldn't stand them up after you started drinking, or after they had been filled, and you had to drink it all in one go, or at least do something with it, park it in some kind of container, or throw it over your shoulder. But these were very high status things that were coming from the Merovingian Empire of France and Spain. So these imports that have survived on this site are showing us that it's very high status.
It's also a very, very extraordinary site. There isn't anywhere quite like it, I don't think.
No, there are isolated sites. The reason that Radford back in the 1930s thought this was a monastery is that you get these island and peninsular sites in Ireland that are covered with cells. And in a way we've got that. We've got these over 100 buildings here that are quite similar in a way. What we're not seeing is a hierarchy, and that's one of the bewildering things for me. You know, you'd think that if you've got a highly ranked site with a king and nobles and the middle class and the working class, you know, that stratified thing, you'd expect to see that reflected in the buildings. But actually we've got buildings all of a similar type here. Now it's possible that the later castle, which was built in the 13th century, might actually be built on top of the original site of the headquarters of the palace, if it was a palace, or the inner echelons. We might have lost it, might be buried there, but we may never know, because we're not going to be able to dig that later castle up.
Of course not. To go back to what you said about the 400 years, what we had clearly when the Romans left, which they did in rather a hurry, was an almighty power vacuum, a security vacuum, an administration vacuum, which is one reason why Arthur has potentially some credibility. There would have been warlords or local leaders, possibly Romano-Brits. What is your hunch?
Well, some of the latest research that's been done by Miles Russell, looking at Geoffrey of Monmouth's writings, is that Arthur seems to be a conglomeration of about 7 different people. One of them is Ambrosius Aurelianus, who was a leader in that post-Roman period. Another one was Magnus Maxentius. There are a whole load of things. He seems to be a sort of palimpsest of people. But yes, there were no doubt some war leaders leading, or perhaps not war leaders, but just leaders leading in that post-Roman vacuum. And one of them may have been called Arthur. There were certainly leaders. Maybe they picked up an idea of Arthur, transferred perhaps from thousands of years before. Some people have suggested he's a very ancient figure, that they've given that name to a collection of individuals to make it into a hero. He is very much a kind of superhero creation, a bit like, you know, Batman or Superman in the modern age. You know, that he is the one who will not just protect us, but he will be there forever.
And that one who might have been Arthur, he could have lived here or at least visited here.
Yes, any person that might not have had the name Arthur, but one of those leaders was undoubtedly here on this site. If we accept that it's a royal site, this site will have influence over certainly all of Cornwall. Because of that prestige, they could not have that prestige without a massive hinterland and an infrastructure that supports them in terms of taxes or in terms of gifts that are given to the leader. And this being a trading site, this wields a lot of power. It isn't just an elite status of people living it up. It's a centre of power. So whoever was leader, and in fact there'll be a series of leaders over that time, could well have been given the name Arthur. This site works perfectly for that.
So there we may just have it, the answer to the age-old Monty Python question, what have the Romans ever done for us? They gave us Arthur. Maybe.